So, motivation seems to me to be the initial framing process. And you come into the world with the motivational systems roughly ready to go. You know, babies are hungry, babies get cold, babies want something to drink. You know, so the world already comes, in some sense, they come into the world with pre-packaged categories for existence, and those are the categories that are going to aid their survival. And you know, they're not simple either. It's not so simple. It's, well, hunger, thirst, pleasure, pain, anxiety, you know, the classic sort of, and the classic emotions, sadness, joy, and so forth. Those systems are already there, but babies have more complicated systems too, like the system for exploration is already in place, and the system for play, which is really complicated, it's already in place. And so, you know, you come into the world with a human nature, and the nature seems to be distributed across these subsystems. That's one way of thinking about it. And it's also useful to think about the operation of those subsystems as something like, you could think about them as games with an aim. You could think about them as stories. You could think about them as frames of reference. You can think about them as action patterns. All of those, and you can think about them as sub-personalities, which I actually think is maybe the best way to think about them. Because if you're hungry, it's not a deterministic drive. It's a sub-personality that has a goal, and then it has a bunch of action patterns that are going to work in reference to that goal. It has a bunch of perceptions that suit that goal, and it organizes your emotional responses around that goal. And so to think about it as a personality is it's a much more intelligent way to look at it. One other thing about Skinner's rats, you know, Skinner could get rats to do almost everything, and he would reward them with food. And so he had a simple rat model, but his rats were starved down to 75% of their normal body weight. So not only were they not social, gregarious rats like rats are, because they were isolated, they were genetically altered from wild rats, but they also weren't as complex as a real rat because they were starving. And so, but you know, a starving rat is a pretty good model of a rat, and a rat is a pretty good model of a person. But a lot of our models of simple behavioral learning were based on starving, isolated rats. So anyways, how to think about motivation? We'll think about it from the hypothalamic perspective. So we could say one thing that motivation does is set goals. And we could say that emotions track progress towards goals. And I'm going to use that schema even though it's not exactly right. So you say, well, motivation determines where you're going to aim. So if you're hungry, you're going to aim at something to eat. And then that will organize your perceptions so that you zero out everything that isn't relevant to that task, which is almost everything. You concentrate on those few things that are going to facilitate your movement forward. When you encounter those things, that produces positive emotion as you move through the world towards your goal, and you see that things are laying themselves out that facilitate your movement forward. Those things cause positive emotion. And if you encounter anything that gets in the way, then that produces negative emotion, and it can be like threat, because you're not supposed to encounter something that gets in the way. It can be anger, so that you move it away. It can be frustration, disappointment, grief. Those would, if you had a response that serious to an obstacle, it would probably punish the little motivated frame right out of existence. You know, so you walk downstairs and, I don't know, the contracting company has set a wrecking ball through your kitchen. It's like, that's going to be disappointing. You're not going to keep eating the peanut butter sandwich in the rubble. That little frame is going to get punished out of existence, and some new goal is going to pop up in its stead. And you know, one of the things we're going to try to sort out is how do you decide when you've encountered an obstacle that's so big that you should just quit and go do something else? Because that's not obvious. You know, and you can get into counterproductive persistence pretty easily. So we don't know how people solve that problem. It's a really complicated one. So anyways, we're going to work on that scenario. Your hypothalamus pops up micro goals that are directly relevant to biological survival. That produces a frame of reference. So it's not a goal, it's not a drive, and it's not a collection of behaviors. It's a little personality. And the personality has a viewpoint, it has thoughts that go along with it. It has perceptions, it has action tendencies, all of that. You can see this in addiction, most particularly. So one of the things that you find often with people who are alcoholic is they lie all the time. And that's because when they've built a little alcohol-dependent personality inside of themselves, or a big one, maybe it's 90% of their personality, and one of the things that consists of is all the rationalizations that they've used over the years to justify their addiction to themselves and to other people. And so the addiction has a personality. You know, and so when the person is off, or maybe they're addicted to meth or something like that, where, you know, the addiction is more, it's more short-term powerful, than I would say, than an alcohol addiction. They'll say anything, and the words are just tools used to get towards the goal. And if they happen to be deceptive, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just practical tools to get towards the goal. And then when you get towards the goal and you take a nice shot of meth or something like that, you reinforce all those rationales that you use to get the drug, and then the next time you're even a better deceiver and liar. So, okay, so we're going to say motivations, one way of thinking about it is they set goals, but it's not the right way of thinking about it. They produce a whole framework of interpretation. And so we're going to think about that framework of interpretation. And then emotions emerge inside of that. So that's it. So the world is framed, motivation set goals. You could say the world has to be framed. So motivation sets that frame. Goals, emotions, perceptions, and actions. And then actions track progress. So positive emotion says you're moving forward properly towards your goal. And if you encounter something you don't expect, you stop. That's anxiety. It's like, oh, we're not where we thought we were. And so we don't know what to do. So we should stop because we don't know where we are or what we're doing. Stop, frozen. And then the more powerful negative emotions like pain, they might make you get out of there. So emotions, forward, stop, reverse. That's your emotions within that motivated frame. So, and that's another example of how your mind is embedded in your body. Your emotions are like they're offshoots of action tendencies. That's the right way to think about it, because action is everything fundamentally. So what are some basic motivations? Most of these are regulated by the hypothalamus, by the way, and that tells you just how important a control system it is. The other thing that's useful to know about the hypothalamus is that it has projections going up from it that are like tree trunks, and inhibitory projections coming down that are like grapevines. So you can kind of control your hypothalamus as long as it's not on too much, but if it's on in any serious way, it's like it wins. So partly what you do to stop yourself from falling under the dominion of your hypothalamus is to never ever be anywhere where its action is necessary, right? You don't want to go into a biker bar because you might find yourself in a situation where panicked defensive aggression is immediately necessary. You probably don't want that. You don't want the panic, you don't want the terror, you don't want the frenzied fight, you don't want any of that. You don't want to have to run away in absolute panic. So you just don't go there. And a huge part of how we regulate our emotions is just by never going anywhere where we have to experience them. And so that has very little to do with internal inhibitory control and everything to do with staying where you belong. So, okay. So, basic motivations. Hunger, thirst, pain. Pain is not regulated by the hypothalamus. That's a different circuit. Anger / aggression. Thermoregulation. Panic and escape. Affiliation and care, sexual desire, exploration, play. And you can kind of break those in, you can kind of break those into the classic Darwinian categories too, and say, well, there's a set of motivations that go along with self-maintenance, that'd be your survival, ingestive and defensive. See, I've sort of coded them there. So the self-maintenance, there's an ingestive set of basic motivations that go with self-maintenance. You say that's hunger, thirst. There's a set of defensive motivations, pain, anger, thermoregulation, panic and escape. And then there's motivations that are associated with reproduction, affiliation, care, and sexual desire. And then I put exploration and play sort of outside of that. I would say because those two things serve both of these approximately equally. So what I tried to do is take the basic motivations and then nest them inside a fundamental Darwinian framework so that you could see how the biological process of evolution has manifested itself and then sort of differentiated into these fundamental biological systems. So, okay, so this is a rat brain flat map. And so it's basically what you would see of a rat's brain if you flattened it out, unrolled it, flattened it out, and then made it two-dimensional. And you can see here, so this is the hypothalamus, and you can see that it's made out of these different nuclei, that's what they're called, and they sort of correspond to those shapes that I showed you in the human hypothalamus earlier. And you see that there's different systems. There's the system for eating and drinking is outlined in green, and the reproductive system, there's two of them, and they're outlined in I think it's red, is that right? Yeah, reproductive is red and the defensive ones are in magenta. And so those are you could think about those as the three fundamental value systems of living creatures with complex nervous systems as far as the hypothalamus is concerned. And then given what I told you about the hypothalamus, which is you hardly need the rest of your brain at all as long as you have a hypothalamus, it's worth thinking that those are very fundamental to value per se. Now, you might think if you only need the damn hypothalamus, why bother with the rest of the brain at all? That's a very useful question, especially because most creatures don't have much of a brain. So, but it seems to be something like, well, you've got your eating and drinking system, your reproductive system, and your defensive system, but the problem is that those things, first of all, can conflict. You know, are you too hungry to sleep or too sleepy to eat? So that's a pretty simple kind of contradiction, you know. Are you more angry at your partner or do you want sexual relations more? So so they can conflict in the present, but then they can conflict with other people doing the same thing, and they can conflict across time. And so partly the reason that you need the rest of your brain is to solve the problems that emerge from the solutions that the hypothalamus offers. And so because you don't want to just eat and drink and reproduce and defend yourself, you want to eat now, later, tomorrow, next week, and next month, while you're able to engage in reproductive activity and defend yourself in multiple contexts with a whole bunch of people for as long as you can possibly manage it. And so you need the rest of your brain to calculate that. And so what the rest of your brain has to do, roughly speaking, is regulate these and also elaborate them up into like into something that's integrated inside you, which might roughly be your personality, and then so that that personality is integrated with the personality of other people. And so you can think about it as an emergent process. This is one of the things I really like about Piaget. He's so damn smart because Piaget is the only thinker I know, really, who really addressed the problem of the evolution of value systems. Like, he never nailed it down to the physiology because there wasn't enough known about physiology when he did his work, but it maps really nicely onto the physiology. But, you know, he said, well, but he got it right anyways. He said, you come into the world with a handful of pre-established reflexes. Okay, we're going to complicate that up a bit. No, you come into the world with a handful of micro-personalities that are centered around these fundamental motivational axes, okay? And then that gets you started. And that has motor output as well as perceptions and all of that that's associated with it. And then as you interact initially, let's say with your mother, you start to learn how to integrate those things in some sort of social context because you form a relationship with your mother right off the bat. And so you're starting to figure out how to produce patterned and stable interactions between those motivational systems on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And one of the things you do with kids, it's really important to do this with kids, is you want to get them onto some sort of a routine. Because what the routine is actually is the beginnings of the system that integrates all of these underlying biological systems into some sort of unity. Because they have to sleep and wake up. So you want to nail that down so it's predictable. You know, they have to eat, they have to stay warm, and they need to do that in a manner that's stable. And so it's to your great benefit as a parent that you get islands of stability planted in the life of your kid so that some of this gets simplified so that the kid isn't constantly preoccupied with domination by these different motivational systems. And so it's a useful thing to know because you might think, well, you don't want to impose any structure on your baby. It's like, no, wrong. You don't want to be a tyrant about it, but there's no difference between that structure and the emergence of the child's adaptation to the world. And to some degree what you're trying to do is free them up from arbitrary domination by these underlying motivational systems. You know, because if a baby gets too tired, it's a horrible little thing. It'll just scream at you non-stop and it's not happy about it. It's like it's not good for anyone for that to happen. And so the faster you have to do it in relationship with the child. I mean, some will sleep right away in a schedule almost immediately, and other kids are harder to get their circadian rhythms regulated. So you have to attend to the individual differences that characterize the child, but you're still trying to establish some stable harmony out of this mishmash of initial systems. So alright, so that's sort of a physiological look at it. This is more of a conceptual look at it. So I said that each of these systems you can think about in a bunch of different ways. You can think about it as something that sets a goal. I'm hungry and I don't want to be hungry. Point A, point B. So the hunger and the vision of the satiation of the hunger are all part of the same frame. And so if you're hungry, you go into the kitchen. You know that already. That's part of your procedural knowledge about how the world works. And then what you're going to look for are only those things that are relevant to what you're trying to do in the kitchen. Everything else is zeroed out. You won't even really see it. And why would you? You want to see the things that are relevant to the task at hand. And so that's the thing that's so cool, I think, because what it means is that you see the things that are relevant to the task at hand. And so here's something to think about. Let's say that you see a whole bunch of things in the world that you don't want to see, you know, that make you constantly miserable and unhappy. One thing you might ask yourself is, are you sure that your goals are proper? Because your goals determine what you see. Now, not 100%, obviously. You can be thinking about the homework you're going to do and step off a curb and be hit by a van. It's like you're going to get hit by the van regardless of how you've oriented your perceptions, likely, in all likelihood. So I'm not trying to argue for pure solipsism, but it is very interesting to consider that since you see in relationship to what you want, that a very large amount of what you see is dependent on what you're aiming at. And so one issue is, if your life is wretched and miserable, one thing to think about is whether or not what you're aiming at is the right thing to be aiming at. And nothing is exactly the wrong answer to that. I'm aiming at nothing. So okay, you're going to experience a tremendous amount of misery and not very much joy.